The pen felt foreign in Thomas Bennett's hand. 5 years of proving up his Wyoming claim, breaking sod, building fence, surviving winters that killed weaker men, and now everything came down to ink on paper. The land office smelled of wood smoke and old documents. February cold seeped through warped floorboards. Thomas stood before the clerk's desk. Studying the contract spread before him like a foreign language, which is what it was. "Just needs your mark, Mr. Bennett," the clerk said, not unkindly, but not patient either. The two men from back east stood nearby, well-dressed, clean-shaven, smiling. They'd introduced themselves as territorial land agents, here to help process homestead paperwork. Thomas had believed them because he wanted to believe them, because the alternative was admitting he couldn't read what they'd put in front of him. He gripped the pen. His hands knew ropes and axes, not this delicate instrument. The speculators exchanged a glance. Satisfaction. They thought he couldn't see it. Thomas bent to the paper, carefully, with the concentration of a man defusing a bomb. He formed the letter X. It was neat, at least. Precise, his mark of ownership, his mark of shame. "Excellent," one speculator said. "Now we just need—" The door opened. Cold air rushed in with a woman Thomas recognized from town. Alice Morgan, the schoolteacher. A widow. People said, kept to herself mostly. Dedicated to her students. She approached the clerk's desk with papers of her own. School district business, probably. Her eyes passed over the scene Thomas, the speculators, the contract, and something in her expression changed. She froze mid-step. Thomas felt heat crawl up his neck. She'd seen him sign with an X like a child, like an ignorant fool. He wanted to disappear through the floorboards. But Alice Morgan wasn't looking at him with pity. She was looking at the speculators with something harder, colder. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding a classroom. "Might I see that contract before you finish?" The speculator's smiles tightened. "Ma'am, this is private business between— I'm certain Mr. Bennett won't mind." Alice stepped closer, her gaze never leaving Thomas. "Will you—" His throat was dry. The humiliation burned, but something in her eyes told him this wasn't about his shame. This was about something else entirely. "No, ma'am," he managed. "I don't mind." She took the contract. Her eyes moved rapidly across the page, her expression darkening with each line. The silence stretched. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. The speculators shifted their weight, their easy confidence beginning to crack. Finally, Alice looked up, first at Thomas, then at the speculators. Her voice was quiet, but it cut like winter wind. "You're being cheated." The words hung in the cold air. Thomas felt dizzy, confused. He'd been so careful, so cautious. How could he be cheated if he'd done everything they asked, ma'am? The taller speculator said smoothly, "I assure you this is standard territorial paperwork. Nothing unusual about—" "Nothing unusual!" Alice's schoolteacher voice sharpened. "This contract transfers land title in exchange for what's described as a temporary administrative lien. Except buried in Section 4. That lien becomes permanent if Mr. Bennett fails to make quarterly payments to you. And you're the ones who determine when those payments are due and how much they are." Thomas's stomach dropped. He understood enough. They could demand payment any time. He'd never be able to keep up. They'd own his land while he thought he owned it. "Furthermore," Alice continued, her finger tracing the dense text, "this clause here makes you co-owners of the property immediately. And this final section, Mr. Bennett. This says if you miss even one payment by their determination, the entire title transfers to them." The shorter speculator tried a different approach. "Miss Morgan, we appreciate your concern, but legal documents are complex. Perhaps if you—" "I can read, sir." Her tone could freeze water. "Mr. Bennett, in plain words, this contract means you'd lose your homestead within 6 months. They'd own everything you've built." Shame crashed into Thomas like a physical blow. 5 years of labor, 3 brutal winters, and he'd nearly signed it all away because he couldn't read, because he'd been too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to admit what he lacked. But beneath the shame, something else stirred. Anger, cold and quiet and righteous. These men had counted on his illiteracy. They'd smiled and called him Mr. Bennett while preparing to steal everything he'd earned through honest work. Is that true? Thomas asked them directly. What she said. The speculator's polished veneer cracked further. Now, Mr. Bennett, you have to understand, territorial law is complicated. Is it true? Silence. Alice folded the contract and handed it back to Thomas. Don't sign this. Don't sign anything they bring you. The taller speculator's smile disappeared entirely. Miss Morgan, I'd be careful about interfering in business matters you don't fully understand. There are proper channels for these transactions, and we'll be back with the appropriate territorial authority. Good day. Then they left, but their exit felt like a threat. The door closed. Thomas stood holding the contract, his signature mocking him from the bottom of the page. Thank you, he said quietly. The words felt inadequate. You saved. His voice caught everything. Alice's expression softened. I'm glad I arrived when I did. She paused, studying him with those sharp teacher's eyes. Mr. Bennett. They'll come back. Men like that don't give up easily. Thomas nodded. He knew. And next time they'd have lawyers, official documents, ways around Alice Morgan's intervention. Next time he'd be alone again, defenseless against words he couldn't read. He walked out into February's gray afternoon, the contract heavy in his pocket. Behind him, Alice Morgan watched through the land office window, her mind already turning over a solution he didn't yet know he needed. Thomas rode home through brittle cold. His homestead spread before him as the sun touched the western peaks 160 acres he'd proved up. Through sheer determination. The cabin he'd built log by log, the barn and corral, cattle bearing his brand, all of it nearly stolen by men with pens, inside. He lit the lamp against the gathering dark. The cabin was clean, spare, functional, bachelor quarters. He'd never minded the solitude before. After his father's farm failed back in Missouri. After his mother died and the land was sold for debt. Thomas had come west seeking something that could never be taken. Land. His own place. But land could be taken. With words. With contracts. With marks made by illiterate fools. He'd learned to work at 7 years old. Too valuable in the fields to waste time in a schoolhouse. His father couldn't read either. Neither could most men on the frontier. It was just how things were. You learned what you needed, how to judge weather, break horses, survive winters. Letters were for lawyers and merchants and schoolteachers. Until today, when letters became the difference between keeping and losing everything. Thomas sat at his rough-hewn table, the contract before him. The words might as well be chicken scratches. Beautiful, mysterious, deadly chicken scratches. Hoofbeats outside startled him. He wasn't expecting visitors. Never had visitors. Through the window, he saw Alice Morgan dismounting. She carried something wrapped in cloth. Thomas opened the door, confused. Miss Morgan, is everything... I'm offering evening lessons, Mr. Bennett. She held up the bundle, a primer and slate. He realized, school supplies. Free of charge. His throat tightened. The shame returned, fresh and burning. Ma'am, I appreciate what you did today, but I can't... Her eyes challenged him. Or won't. I'm 42 years old. I'm not... What you're not is stupid. Mr. Bennett, you built this cabin. You've survived 5 winters here. You run cattle and manage land. You can learn to read. Thomas wanted to refuse. Pride screamed at him to send her away, to handle this alone somehow. But survival whispered something different. Those speculators were coming back. Next time with lawyers. Next time he'd have no Alice Morgan to save him. I'm a slow learner, ma'am. The admission hurt. Never got the chance as a boy. Alice's expression softened. Not pity, something gentler. Understanding. Slow and steady built this cabin, didn't it? He couldn't argue with that. She stepped inside, setting her supplies on the table. 3 evenings a week. We'll start simple. Letters, then words, then sentences. By spring, you'll be able to read a contract well enough to know when someone's trying to cheat you. By spring, 3 months. It seemed impossible. But so had building this cabin once. So had surviving his first Wyoming winter. All right, Thomas said. When do we start? Now. Alice unwrapped the primer and slate. She traced a letter on the slate with chalk. This is a... Thomas pulled up a chair. Outside. February wind rattled the door. Snow began falling again, soft and persistent. Inside. Lamplight made a small circle of warmth against the dark. Alice guided his hand. Your turn. His calloused finger followed the chalk's path. The letter looked crude, childish. But it was his. His first letter. 42 years old and learning what children knew. Good, Alice said. Now B. The lamp burned steady as winter pressed close. Inside, something new began. Something those speculators hadn't counted on. A man learning to read. A teacher finding purpose again. 2 lonely people discovering that the frontier's hardest work might not be surviving nature, but surviving isolation. 3 weeks passed like water wearing stone. Slow, steady, inexorable. Thomas learned letters the way he'd learned everything else through repetition and stubborn will. Monday, Wednesday, Friday evenings. Alice arrived at dusk. They fell into rhythm. She taught. He practiced. The cabin that had known only silence for 5 years filled with voices reading aloud, testing words, breaking language into manageable pieces. His hands, made for rough work, struggled with the pen. Each letter was a small battle, each word, a victory that left him exhausted and proud in equal measure. Again, Alice would say, patient but firm. The tail of the G drops below the line. Thomas tried again. Failed, tried once more, got it close enough. Better, she'd say, and that single word carried more weight than gold. By the 3rd week, he could write his name, not with an X, but with letters THOMAS. The first time he managed it clearly. His hands shook with emotion he couldn't name, pride, relief, something deeper than both. Alice watched him stare at his own name like it was magic. That's yours now, she said softly. No one can take it from you. They talked more as the lessons continued, not just about letters, but about life. Alice revealed herself in careful pieces she'd taught school in Ohio before following her husband west. James Morgan had dreams of ranching, but Wyoming's first winter took him before he could build those dreams. Pneumonia. Fast and merciless. I stayed because of the children, she said one evening. Her voice distant. They needed a teacher, and I needed... She paused. I needed something to give me a reason to wake up each day. Thomas understood that. After his mother died, work had been his salvation. Fence posts and livestock and endless labor that left him too tired to think, too tired to feel the loneliness. You're a good teacher, he said, awkward with compliments. Patient. You're a good student, determined. She smiled slightly. Stubborn as a Missouri mule, but determined. How'd you know I was from Missouri? The way you pronounce certain words. James was from Missouri, too. Something passed between them, recognition, understanding. They were both refugees from loss. Both rebuilding from wreckage. The town noticed. Of course. Medicine Bow was too small for secrets. Some folks approved the widow teacher helping the bachelor homesteader seemed practical, even charitable. Others whispered. A woman visiting a man's cabin 3 times a week raised eyebrows. invited speculation. Alice ignored the whispers with the same calm authority she'd shown at the land office. By late March, Thomas could read simple sentences from the primer. The man works hard for his land. Each word came slowly, but they came. He sounded like a child, halting and uncertain, but he read. When he finished that first complete sentence, his voice cracked. Alice's eyes shone with something that looked like pride, like joy. Neither spoke about what the moment meant. Neither named the way their partnership was shifting into something else. Something neither had expected when she'd arrived that first evening with her primer and slate. But it was there, undeniable as spring's first thaw. The way Thomas made sure coffee was ready when she arrived. The way Alice lingered after lessons, talking by the fire. The way silence between them had changed from awkward to comfortable. Outside, fall spring arrived, warm winds melting snow, revealing brown grass beneath. Inside, Thomas practiced writing sentences while Alice graded school papers. Companionable. Easy. Like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. Alice, he said one evening. Not Miss Morgan anymore. She looked up from her papers. Yes. Thank you. For this. For... He gestured at the primer. The slate. The cabin that felt less lonely now. Everything. She smiled, soft and genuine. You're welcome, Thomas. His name in her voice, her name on his lips. Small things that meant everything. April's false spring turned stubborn. Warm days fooled the meadowlarks into returning early. Ice broke on the creek. Thomas's cattle grazed on exposed grass. And for a few weeks, Wyoming felt almost gentle. The lessons continued. But they'd become more than lessons. They'd become the center of both their weeks. Thomas practiced reading between Alice's visits, struggling through the primer until words started making sense without feeling like code. He could write simple sentences now, could read signs in town without feeling shame, could look at a newspaper and understand most of the words, even if he read slowly enough to frustrate a preacher. One Wednesday evening, after lessons ended, they sat by the fire with coffee. Alice looked tired. Her schoolhouse work was demanding 27 students ranging from 6 to 14, all needing attention, guidance, hope. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, she said quietly. If teaching letters and sums matters, when half these children will spend their lives just trying to survive. Out here, Thomas considered that. You saved my land, he said finally, by teaching me to read. You're giving me a chance those speculators never expected. That matters, I suppose. But her voice carried doubt, weariness. Why'd you stay? Thomas asked. After your husband died, you could have gone back east. Alice stared into the fire. I almost did. That first winter after James died, I packed my trunk 3 separate times. I'd wake up and the loneliness was suffocating. The silence in my rooms felt alive, hungry. Thomas knew that feeling. He'd lived with it for 5 years. But then a little girl, Martha Henderson, started reading ahead in the primer, just because she loved it. And I realized if I left, who would feed that hunger? Who would give these children something beyond survival? She looked at Thomas, then really looked at him. You asked why I stayed. The truth is, teaching saved me, giving these children hope, education, a future. It pulled me out of grief, made me remember that life could still have purpose. Thomas set down his coffee. You're not the only one who needed saving. Alice. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to name. I've been on this claim 5 years, Thomas continued slowly. 5 years and I've spoken maybe 100 words to another soul. Didn't seem worth it. Talking. I mean, when you can't read a man's written word, you learn silence is safer. Can't be tricked if you don't engage. That's not living, Alice said softly. That's just surviving. I know. He met her eyes, You gave me more than reading. Alice, you gave me back the world. The fire crackled. Outside, a coyote called to the emerging spring. Inside, something shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained teacher and student. Widow and bachelor dissolved like snow in sunlight. Thomas, Alice said, and his name in her voice sounded different now. Personal. Tender. I should tell you something. The lessons coming here, it's not just charity. It's not even just about stopping those speculators. He waited. It's because when I'm here, teaching you, talking with you, I don't feel lonely. I feel... She paused, searching for words. I feel like myself again. Like Alice, not just the schoolteacher widow everyone handles with careful pity. Thomas's heart hammered. Same time Friday, he asked, his voice rough. She smiled. Wouldn't miss it. Thomas. When she left that night. Thomas stood in the doorway watching her ride toward town. The moon was bright enough to guide her path. Spring peepers sang in the marshy ground near the creek. Inside, he sat at his table and practiced writing. Not from the primer this time, but something else. Words that came from his own mind, his own heart. He wrote slowly, making mistakes, crossing out, trying again. By lamplight, 42 years old. Thomas Bennett learned that literacy wasn't just about reading contracts. It was about expressing things he'd kept locked inside for decades. Things like hope, like gratitude, like the beginning of love. The speculators returned the last week of April. Thomas saw them first at the general store. The same two men, still polished despite the frontier dust. They nodded to him with cold courtesy. Nothing more. But their presence sent ice through his veins. That afternoon, official papers arrived via the territorial courier. Competing land claims on Thomas's homestead. The speculators had filed documentation citing irregularities in Thomas's original filing. The X signature, they argued, could be anyone's mark. How could he prove it was truly his when he couldn't read the papers he'd signed? Thomas read the notice 3 times. Slowly. Carefully. But he read it. Understanding came hard and bitter. They'd found a new angle. They were questioning whether his original homestead claim was even valid. A hearing was scheduled. 2 weeks. The Territorial Land Office would decide. Thomas rode to the schoolhouse. Alice was dismissing students when he arrived. She saw his face and knew immediately something was wrong. He handed her the papers. She read quickly, her expression darkening with each line. They're clever, she said finally. Claiming your original filing was fraudulent because you couldn't read what you signed. Therefore, you didn't understand what you were filing for. Therefore, the claim is void and open to new filing. Can they do that? Legally. Alice's jaw tightened. It's questionable. But with the right territorial judge, the right pressure, the right money-changing hands, yes. They might. Thomas felt everything slipping away. The land, the cabin, 5 years of work. I can read now. Some. But legal documents, contract language, I'm not ready for that. Then we make you ready. Alice's voice turned fierce. 2 weeks. We work every evening. I'll teach you every legal term, every trick they use, every clause they might hide. The next day, Thomas saw the speculators again. This time they approached him directly on Medicine Bow's main street. Mr. Bennett, the taller one said, we bear you no ill will. These are simply business matters. Territorial law requires proper documentation. I documented everything. Thomas said carefully. Filed proper when I claimed the land. With an X. The shorter speculator smiled. That's the issue. Anyone could have made that mark. We're just ensuring the land goes to its rightful owner. It has, perhaps. The hearing will determine that. They left him standing in the street, their meaning clear. They had lawyers. They had money. They had the system's ear. What did he have? Barely 3 months of reading lessons and a schoolteacher who'd made them angry. That evening, the same speculators appeared at Alice's boarding house. She was on the porch when they rode up. "Miss Morgan," the taller one said, his voice oily with false concern. "We wanted to speak with you about a delicate matter. I don't believe we have anything to discuss. It concerns your position as schoolteacher." Now his smile turned sharp. "Certain parents have expressed concern. Your frequent visits to Mr. Bennett's cabin. Your passionate involvement in business matters that don't concern you. These things reflect on your character, your judgment." Alice stood motionless, but Thomas could see her hands tighten on the porch rail. "Are you threatening me?" she asked quietly. "Threatening, good heavens, no. We're simply concerned citizens, but you should know that questions have been raised. The school board meets next month. It would be unfortunate if your contract wasn't renewed due to concerns about propriety." They rode off, leaving Alice standing alone. Thomas found out that evening when he arrived for their lesson. She told him everything, her voice steady but her eyes blazing. "I'm stopping the lessons," Thomas said immediately. "I won't let them ruin your livelihood because you helped me." "Absolutely not." "Alice, they're counting on us to fold." "Thomas, that's how men like that win. They threaten, they pressure, they make good people afraid. We stand together, or we both lose." She pulled out fresh papers, new primers focused on legal language. "Now sit down. We have work to do." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to protect her, but he recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had at the land office that first day. Righteous fury meeting injustice. A teacher protecting her student. A woman who'd decided some battles were worth fighting. "They'll come after you harder," he warned. "Let them try." Alice opened the primer. "Now, this is the language they use for property liens. Learn it. Because in 2 weeks, you're going to prove you know exactly what you signed and what you didn't." Outside. Spring had arrived for real this time. But inside the cabin, they prepared for war. Not with guns or fists, but with words, with literacy, with the quiet determination of two people who'd learned that sometimes the bravest stand you could make was refusing to surrender what you'd earned. The April blizzard hit without warning. Thomas sat in his cabin surrounded by papers, practice contracts Alice had written, legal terminology lists, documents similar to what the speculators might present. He'd been drilling himself for hours, but the words still swam sometimes. Still confused him when they used fancy phrasing to hide simple theft. The hearing was in 5 days. 5 days to become proficient enough to defend himself in front of a territorial clerk, and God knew how. Many lawyers the speculators would bring. He was drowning. Might as well admit it. Snow began falling hard, turning the world white beyond his windows. Spring had lied. Winter always came back for one final punishment. Wyoming's way of teaching humility. Thomas closed the primers. What was the point? He could read simple words now. Could write his name. Could manage basic sentences. But legal documents, the kind of sophisticated deception buried in contract language, he was still prey. Still vulnerable. The speculators would win. He'd lose his land. And worse, Alice would lose her position for trying to help him. They'd destroy her out of spite, to teach other meddlers a lesson. He should have just signed that first contract. At least then Alice wouldn't be suffering for his pride. The knock came around 8 o'clock. Thomas opened the door to find Alice standing in the blizzard, covered in snow, shaking with cold. "What are you—" He pulled her inside. "You walked through this. You gave up." Her voice shook, but not from cold, from fury. "I can see it in your face. You're ready to surrender." "Alice, they have lawyers. They have money. They have judges in their pocket. What do I have? Me." She stripped off her snow-covered coat. "You have me. And you have yourself a man who built this cabin, who survived 5 winters, who's learned more in 3 months than most people learn in years. It's not enough. You think literacy is magic." Her eyes blazed. "It's not. It's work. The same work you put into every fence post on this land. You think I can't see you doubting I taught school for 8 years? Thomas, I know when a student is ready to quit. She pulled fresh papers from her bag. Contract samples. Legal terminology sheets. We drill until dawn. Every trick they might use. Every clause they might hide. You're going to know this material so well you could spot their lies in your sleep. Alice. No. She sat at his table, fierce and immovable. You said I saved you. Fine. Now I'm saving you again. But this time you're going to save yourself. You're going to stand in that land office and read their lies aloud and show everyone that an honest man, with 3 months of education, can outthink cheaters with law degrees. The blizzard raged outside. Inside, Alice drilled him mercilessly, contract clauses, legal terms, the way speculators buried theft in legitimate-looking language. She'd obviously researched their tactics, studied how they operated. Hours passed. Thomas's head ached. His eyes burned, but slowly. Pieces clicked together. He started recognizing patterns, the way they'd phrase things to sound official while meaning something else, the clauses that seemed harmless but contained traps. Again, Alice said. This clause about administrative oversight. What does it really mean? Thomas read carefully. Means they decide if I'm meeting terms. They're the judge of whether I'm in compliance. And if they decide you're not, property transfers to them. Exactly. Her approval warmed him more than the fire. You're seeing it now. You're reading between the lines. Dawn broke clear and cold. The blizzard had passed. Thomas made coffee while Alice organized their materials. He felt different, still nervous, still uncertain, but no longer drowning. He'd been tested and hadn't broken. Alice stood at the window, watching sunrise paint the snow-covered landscape. I haven't been completely honest with you, she said quietly. Thomas waited. After I saw those speculators at the land office that first day, I started investigating. I wrote to other territorial offices, asked about fraudulent land claims, pattern of deception. She turned to face him. I found 3 other homesteaders they've done this too. All illiterate men. All lost their claims through contracts they couldn't read. She pulled out a thick envelope. This is documentation of their fraud. Letters from those homesteaders, copies of the contracts, a formal complaint I've written to the territorial governor. Thomas stared at her. You've been building a case while teaching you to read. Yes. We're not just defending your claim. Thomas, we're stopping them from doing this to anyone else. You could have told me. You needed to focus on learning, on believing you could do this. Her eyes held his. But you should know this isn't just about you and me anymore. This is about justice. About proving that honest people can stand against corruption. Thomas crossed to her. Without thinking, he took her hand. We're partners in this. Yes. She squeezed his fingers. Partners. The word meant more than business, more than friendship. They both knew it. But there'd be time for that conversation later, after the hearing, after they'd won. Same time tomorrow, Thomas asked. Alice smiled, exhausted but fierce. Wouldn't miss it. She left through snow that sparkled in morning sun. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching her go. 5 days until the hearing. 5 days to finish preparing. But he wasn't afraid anymore. The lamp still burned on his table. He returned to it, picked up the practice contracts, and began reading. Slowly, carefully, but reading. The land office was packed when Thomas arrived. Half of Medicine Bow had come to watch, some supporting him, some curious about the spectacle, some hoping to see justice done. The speculators sat with their lawyer at a corner table, confident. Press suits, leather satchels full of documents. They didn't look worried. Thomas wore his cleanest shirt, his only jacket. He carried nothing but the practice materials Alice had given him and his own determination. Alice sat in the back row, her documentation ready, her face calm. The territorial clerk called the hearing to order. We're here regarding competing claims on the Bennett homestead. Mr. Lawson, you may present. The speculator's lawyer stood an older man with silver hair and Eastern credentials. Thank you, sir. Our case is straightforward. Mr. Bennett's original homestead filing is invalid due to his inability to read the documentation he signed. An X mark could be made by anyone, without literacy. He couldn't have understood what he was filing for. Therefore, the claim was fraudulent from the start, rendering the land open to proper filing by my clients. Murmurs through the room. The logic was slick, poisonous. The clerk looked at Thomas. Mr. Bennett, you filed 5 years ago with an X signature. Can you verify that mark was yours? Thomas stood. His legs felt steady. Yes, sir. I made that mark. I couldn't read then, but I understood what I was doing. Claiming homestead rights to 160 acres. I've proved up that claim legal 3 years of continuous occupation, improvements, cultivation, but you couldn't read the filing papers. The lawyer interjected smoothly. So how could you truly understand the legal requirements? Man didn't need reading to understand sweat and survival. Thomas said, I met every requirement, built my cabin, worked the land, ran cattle. That's proof of claim, not letters on paper. Nevertheless, the lawyer began. Mr. Bennett, the clerk interrupted. Can you read now? Some been learning since February. The clerk considered. Mr. Lawson, your clients are here with new documentation. Yes, sir. Proper homestead filing, fully understood and executed by literate men. The lawyer produced papers with a flourish. We ask Mr. Bennett to review these documents. If he can read and understand them, we'll concede that literacy isn't the issue. But we believe these will demonstrate the complexity of territorial law and why his original filing was invalid. The papers were passed to Thomas. The room went silent. Thomas took his time. His hands didn't shake. He read the first page slowly, carefully. It was dense legal language about property transfer. Then page 2. More contract clauses about terms and conditions. And there buried in the third paragraph, the trap. This document, Thomas said clearly, looking at the speculators. This says I would pay you rent on land I already own. Right here. Monthly administrative fees for property oversight. That's rent by another name. The lawyer started to speak. Thomas kept going. And this part here, shared title pending compliance verification, that makes you co-owners immediately. Before I've failed any requirement, you'd own half my land just by me signing. Whispers rippled through the room. The speculators exchanged glances. Thomas continued to the final page. And this last section, title transfer upon determination of non-compliance by primary stakeholders. You're the primary stakeholders, which means you decide if I'm failing. And when you decide I've failed, you take everything. He set the papers down and looked directly at the speculators. This isn't a homestead filing. This is theft dressed up in legal words. The room erupted. People talking over each other. The clerk banged his gavel for order. Alice stood. Mr. Clerk, I have documentation relevant to this case. She approached with her envelope. These are complaints from 3 other territorial homesteaders who lost their claims to these same men. Using similar contracts, the pattern is clear. They target illiterate homesteaders, use complex language to hide property theft, and profit from good men's vulnerability. The clerk reviewed her papers. His expression darkened. Mr. Lawson, he said finally, your client's competing claim is denied. Mr. Bennett's original homestead filing stands as valid. Furthermore, I'm forwarding this documentation to the territorial governor for investigation into fraudulent practices. The speculators stood abruptly. No polite farewells this time. They left under the weight of public disgust, their lawyer hurrying after them. The clerk looked at Thomas. Mr. Bennett, your claim is secure. And I apologize that it took this long to recognize what these men were doing. Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. People approached to congratulate him, to shake his hand, to tell him they'd never doubted. Thomas barely heard them. He was looking at Alice, standing by the window, sunlight in her hair. They stepped outside together. April warmth. Genuine spring finally arrived. The battle was won. Not with violence, not with force, but with truth spoken in words he'd learned to read. May settled over Wyoming like a blessing. Thomas sat at his cabin table, lamplight unnecessary now with long evening sun streaming through windows. Before him lay clean paper, his pen, and words that came easier each day. He wrote slowly, carefully, "Dear Alice, will you marry me and help me build a life worth reading about?" He folded the letter. His handwriting wasn't beautiful like hers, but it was clear. It was his, not an ex, but words expressing what he'd carried silently for weeks. The ride to town took an hour. Alice was tending her small garden behind the boarding house when he arrived. She looked up, surprised, and smiled. "Thomas, this is unexpected." He handed her the letter. "I practiced this 30 times, figured I should write it proper." Alice unfolded the paper. Her eyes moved across his careful script. She was quiet so long, Thomas's heart began to hammer. Maybe he'd presumed too much. Maybe, yes, she said softly, then louder. Looking at him with those fierce teacher's eyes now bright with tears, "Yes, Thomas Bennett, I will." She took her own pen from her apron pocket. A teacher was never without one, and wrote on the bottom of his letter in her perfect script, "Yes, with all my heart." They married in June. The schoolhouse was packed students, parents, townspeople who'd witnessed their quiet battle and victory. The preacher spoke about courage and partnership. Thomas barely heard him. He was too focused on Alice in her simple dress, her hand in his, her voice steady as she spoke vows. That fall, Thomas hired help with the cattle so he could continue lessons. Not just reading now, but history, mathematics, things he'd never dreamed he could understand. Alice taught in the evenings, patient and demanding in equal measure. The following spring, their daughter arrived. They named her Hope. Thomas taught her letters before she could walk. He'd trace them on the cabin floor, on steam-frosted windows, in garden dirt. A is for apple. B is for bread. Simple lessons that meant everything. One evening, Hope asleep in her cradle, Thomas opened their family Bible, a wedding gift from the church. On the family records page, he wrote carefully, "Thomas Bennett. Born 1842, Missouri. Alice Morgan Bennett. Born 1845, Ohio, married. June 1885. Medicine Bow. Wyoming, Hope Bennett. Born April 1886. No X marks. Only names. Only words claiming his family as his own." Alice watched from the doorway. "What are you thinking?" Thomas looked up. "That I'm grateful. For you. For her. For second chances." "Third chances," Alice corrected gently. "You built this life once already. Then you learned to read and rebuilt it. Now we're building it together." Outside, Wyoming spread vast and free. Cattle grazed his secure land. The cabin they'd expanded together stood solid against whatever weather came. Inside, their daughter slept safe, destined for education, for choices, for a life where words would be tools, not weapons used against her. Thomas closed the Bible and moved to the window. The lamp on their table burned steady, not fighting darkness now, but illuminating the life they'd built. A life worth reading about, worth writing down, worth passing to a child who'd never know the shame of an ex, the vulnerability of silence. "I love you," he said. Simple words. But they came easily now. Alice crossed to him, took his hand. "I love you too." Spring had come to stay, not just in the weather, but in their hearts. In the words they spoke, in the letters they taught, in the promise that their children would inherit not just land, but dignity, not just survival, but the tools to build whatever life they could dream. The frontier required many kinds of courage. Thomas and Alice had proved that sometimes the bravest act was admitting you needed help, that the strongest partnership was built on mutual respect, that words read, written, spoken truthfully could be mightier than any gun. The land was secure. The words were their own, and spring, finally, had come to stay.